Welcome back. We're talking with one of the great strategic thinkers of our time, as far as I'm concerned. His name's J.R. Nyquist, or better known to his friends, of whom uh, them I count myself. Jeff Nyquist. He is a blogger, an author of a lot of periodical literature, including in places like the Epoch Times. He is also an author of some very important books, including The Origins of the Fourth World War. And there are some who believe we may well be in a world war at the moment, or an incipient one at least. One of those is a former congresswoman by the name of Tulsi Gabbard of the state of Hawaii. Now, a former member, she has been very active in recent years, drawing on her experience, I believe, in the United States Army, uh, talking about Syria, talking about other Middle Eastern challenges, and recently about Ukraine. And she's taken a line that seems to be pretty much tracking with that of Archbishop Vigano, who we've just been critiquing with Jeff. Tell us a little bit about Tulsi Gabbard. You had a recent podcast with another of our friends and colleagues, Trevor Loudon, in which he was very critical of the former congresswoman and her thinking not only on this subject, but others as well. Give us a flavor of his and yours, if you would, Jeff.
Well, he was explaining how she was basically a Bernie girl. That is, Bernie Sanders, the socialist American Democrat from Vermont. Um, she's very far to the left in her actual past affiliations and activities, but yet she very seemingly deceptively and very persuasively depicts herself as a centrist, with using her military background to appeal to people on the right and to the patriotic crowd. And if you examine her rhetoric, it is very carefully balanced to create a deceptive picture of who she actually is. I mean, now she's gone. I understand she spoke at CPAC here recently. She's basically, in the past, she's been a socialist. When did she convert away from socialism exactly? This deceptive nature, watching her messages, I had the feeling that I was watching somebody that, if she'd been in the Garden of Eden instead of Eve, she would have talked the snake into eating the fruit. Yeah.
Well, she's persuasive. She's very attractive. She's very articulate, and she certainly has a theory of the case that is persuasive to some. Let's be honest. Specifically, there is this very much Bernie Sanders-esque, if I can use that expression, uh, enmity towards the so-called military-industrial complex, and the idea that really what's happening here with Ukraine and the concerns that are being expressed by people both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party is just kind of engineered by people who seek to make a profit off of war, and may not have the national interests of the United States at heart. Um, it ties into a kind of isolationist sentiment that I find very troubling, as well as defaming people who do for a living the business of trying to make sure that we are adequately prepared for some very, very dangerous times. Your thoughts on those sort of lines of attack, like
Yeah,
what
well,
Tulsi Gabbard?
demonizing the military industrial complex, quoting Eisenhower, is a stock and trade of those who are really enemies of American national security, who really kind of favor America's enemies. Yeah, there's some problems. There's always problems of corruption. You talked about, corruption in Ukraine. Does a country have to be perfect for you to actually fight for it or believe that it needs to be defended? That would be ridiculous. We'd have to have countries made up of angels to defend them. The fact of the matter is our enemies, particularly the Russians, if you go back to Soviet literature, they're always harping on two things: the warmongering circles in Washington and the Pentagon, and the capitalists. Those are the enemies. And if you listen carefully to what these people are saying, the enemies are the wealthy people, the malefactors of great wealth, and the Pentagon, the military industrial complex, which is a way of being against America while claiming that you're patriotic. They've turned it into that. Yeah.
It is. And we've seen Tucker Carlson, who I admire on a lot of scores, very much embracing this kind of narrative and claiming that, we're calling everybody who disagrees, agents of the Kremlin. I'm certainly not saying that, but I do worry about some of the rhetoric that's being advanced here.
Well, the Russians lie so much. I mean, you look at this invasion of Ukraine. You remember Sergei Lavrov said, "We're not going to invade Ukraine." Then they're saying, "We're pulling back. The exercise is done." And then the invasion happens. And of course, Putin's saying, "Well, it's not an invasion because it's our territory. So you can't invade your own territory." I mean, these are the sneaky use of words that we see here. And to have people being in sympathy with the Russian side makes them very vulnerable to believing some of these lies. And the problem is the Russians lie so much, you only have to believe a few of them to be basically neutralized by them.
Yeah, paralyzed, in effect. Jeff, this brings me to the last point, and it's a very serious threat, I believe, to our liberties here at home. I call it the enemy within phenomenon, but we're being told that the national security agencies of the United States now must be turned against the enemies within, which they would have us believe are, well, people like thee and me, people who are patriotic Americans, people who love this country, people who support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and who are nonetheless being portrayed as not sufficiently aligned with Joe Biden, not sufficiently simpatico with his policy agenda, and therefore potential, if not actual, domestic terrorists. What do you make of both that line of attack out of, I think, the Marxist playbook, and the implications of these agencies now being weaponized in this fashion?
Well, it's very dangerous if one political narrative, which happens to come from the left, claims that Russia's our enemy and that we need to crush the right because you've got right-wing voices supporting the Russians. I can kind of feel like this is where they're headed with this. And the only thing to say is that these people have always helped the Russians, and in terms of helping the country's defense, they've been against increasing our actual effective defense and our nuclear arsenal, and our Navy's shrinking under Biden. So, yeah.
Yeah, and funding is being deferred on investments in other areas as well. And Jeff, I guess to your point about the ties that many of these people have, and I go back to Hillary Clinton, one of them that I think we've talked about in the past that is just absolutely incalculably alarming is the effort to build under the rubric of something called Skolkovo, a Silicon Valley for Russia as part of the Great Reset that they envisioned, in which they were going to transfer a lot of technology from the United States, including militarily relevant technology, in fact, even hypersonic missile technology, to the Russians. Interestingly enough, with a high correlation among the people whose technology would be transferred, who were actually donors to the Clinton Foundation as well, a sort of classic Clinton pay-to-play scheme. But it's really worrying that they have almost certainly greatly enhanced the threat we face from that quarter, and have done so probably to their personal benefit, but not to that of the country. Jeff, we have to leave it at that. I'm sorry to say there's so much more to talk about, but I appreciate you starting this conversation and shedding light on so many really important topics. And we'll look forward to visiting with you again next week, I hope, to further establish where we're headed on Ukraine, on Russia, and the future of NATO, for that matter. For the moment, though, thank you for your time and the great work you do at jrnyquist.blog. Next up, we're going to be speaking with Michael Yon, a fabulous war correspondent and journalist.